Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome back to this uh, lecture on. Sorry, to this lecture on Tom Jones, where I discuss, among many other issues, a considerable number of thematic concerns within the novel. I'd like to begin here by referring to first the use of myths in Tom Jones. Now, as I pointed out, that the novel actually sort of looked both towards its past and to its present. So the incidents that Fielding sort of takes up are all contemporary in that sense of the term. And secondly, he's using the modern forms like biography, autobiography, uh, criminal biographies, criminal narratives, picaresque, and so on and so forth. Uh, but at the same time, he was also looking at the older forms like comedy, tragedy, and also myth. Now, importantly, how does Fielding treat myth? He structures this novel across the myth Odyssey, of the Odyssey, where uh, where Tom is engaging on a series of adventures. So the pattern of continuous movement and continuous adventure is based on the Odyssey myth. In the first segment, very carefully, with Paradise Hall, the myth of the Garden of Eden is invoked, and therefore you have the comic Blifil here, the comic Satan, who causes Tom's breach from paradise, and at the end, it is also another classical myth, really, the myth of Telemachus, who journeys to the underworld in search of his father and regains his identity. Therefore, Fielding is bringing in the classical myth of Telemachus again. Now, interestingly, what I would like you to note is how Fielding is bridging or simultaneously using this Christian and classical myths, principally because together they help him formulate a structure and identify his novel with some classical forms. Why? Why not purely root itself in the contemporary, just as uh, Defoe would have done? Of course, I should have also mentioned that the fourth myth to be used is that of the Oedipal myth, where almost on the verge of committing incest, Tom learns that ultimately, Mrs. Waters is not his mother. So why use classical myth? Primarily because Fielding is also trying to provide the novel with a degree of respectability, right? So at this point of time, when the novel was not yet legitimized, not yet accepted as a form, Fielding's Fielding's harking back to classical forms was trying to provide it with a degree of ancient legitimacy, along with modern narratives. So, this Janus facedness of the novel, looking both simultaneously backwards and forwards, is something that is evident in Fielding's use of the myth. But myth, remember, is used in terms of the structural principles and adds to the complexity of the plot of Tom Jones. As I kept on reminding you in that earlier essay, you know, one of the most complex plots ever planned, right? So that's issue number one. Why does Fielding use myth? What are the myths that Fielding uses? And why does he particularly use these myths, right? So while he's using these myths, remember that he's replacing at the center of the novel the unheroic hero and thereby, undercutting these myths continuously, right? So the myths, the seriousness of the myths is, as it were, undercut by the comic flavor of the novel, and that you are always aware that ultimately, Tom will not turn out to be Oedipus, or Tom will not turn out to be like Odysseus. So there is always a kind of a frame, a larger frame that the myth creates, and there's a smaller undercutting of the frame that is provided by Fielding, right? So that is an interesting idea. The second thing that the issue that one needs to study is that of Paradise Hall. Now, what is the importance of Paradise Hall in the novel? And I'm going to argue that Paradise Hall is more central to the novel than many of you think. Now, at the onset, it is Paradise Hall for which Tom and Blifil are not only located, but the question is, who is the heir apparent of Paradise Hall? And Paradise Hall is part of the landed gentry, right? Part of the landed gentry, part of the tradition of land owning families. And therefore, the estate to which an heir is needed. And it is apparently Blifil. The Paradise Hall is also the mythical paradise, the Garden of Eden, presided over by the benevolent Allworthy, and contains the satanic Blifil and the figure of the Adam-like Tom, who is marked by his libido and therefore will be banished from it. So at one level, Paradise Hall is at the center of the mythical structure of Tom Jones. Tom will be moving away from it, will be banished from it, and will regain it in the closure of the novel. Right. So in terms of structure, Paradise Hall stays right at the middle of the text. But I think there's something else which is also happening. And this has something to do with the social churning that takes place in 18th century England, especially the issue of the conflict between the merchants and the landowners. Now, you will have remembered that with the rise of the merchant class, a kind of struggle for dominance between the landed gentry, erstwhile dominant class, and the upcoming merchant class was developing. You have seen this also in Bengal and India when the new jomidars tried to buy into the old landed gentries. Now, what therefore happens is that the landed gentry progressively becomes threatened as an obsolete and powerless class. Now, this just started, remember, in the 18th century. It's not yet, fully formulated. You see some of it also in, say, a novel like John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman, which talks about the Victorian era and the new gentleman. But Fielding is anticipating this because he's also part of the landed gentry. He's based in Somersetshire. He's become a magistrate in his own right. And therefore, he's witnessing this gradual disempowerment of the landed gentry. Therefore, he realizes that the consolidation of the landed gentry is required to stave off the interest of the merchant class. And therefore, this alliance of Allworthy's heir and Western's heir, right? And therefore, you can see this also, Paradise Hall also, as situated in the center of a social conflict, right? A social conflict and a social churning between the two classes. So the consolidation of, Western estate and the Allworthy estate is therefore a symbol of the continued power of the landed gentry. The third thing that one needs to see is that Paradise Hall contains within itself the notion of the ideal hero. How? Because it combines the bodily urges of the Western household and the prudence of the Allworthy household. So, Allworthy and Western appear to be two polar opposites in the sense that they are always looking at the issue of the two parts of the human personality. So within Paradise Hall, there is this debate as to what this personality will look like. Is it going to be a Puritan like Blifil, or is it and Puritan hypocrite like Blifil, or a generous, libidinous, controlled, prudent individual like Tom? So Tom's journey to Paradise Hall, as I said, is a journey from libido to prudence, and the unification of the bodily and the cerebral that takes place. So Paradise Hall is symbolic at a large number of levels, not only in terms of structure, but also it is symbolic in terms of the social and the moral, ethical core of the novel. So that's the second issue that I wanted to talk about. The third issue that I want to talk about is the issue of the bastard. You see, it's thrown in your face literally when Fielding talks about Tom Jones as being a foundling, somebody who's found, therefore a bastard. Now, you see, in the 18th century, prior to the 18th century, the bastard is seen as this kind of the lowest of classes because he does not have any parentage as such. Therefore, he does not have identity as such. One. Secondly, the bastard is also seen as somebody who is socially unstable. Now, just think about King Lear and the figure of Edgar, really, Edmund, really. Now, you see how the figure of the bastard becomes a radically destabilizing agent who can create havoc in society because he has no rootedness, he has no sense of alliance or sense of faithfulness to anybody, and he's marked by this sense of malcontent of society, as an outcast of society. Therefore, the bastard is seen as a positive danger to society, right? Allying himself with the malcontent figure, and therefore possibly creating social turbulence. In Tom Jones, however, you see, the bastard is finally integrated as the heir of Allworthy Hall. Now, also remember that at this point of time, social mobility is a major factor. People coming to England, establishing themselves in London through trade and commerce. And therefore, there is a process through which, the concept of base born, which was so dominant in feudal society, can now become redundant. And there is a degree of social acceptance of the bastard, right? So from the bastard on the fringes of the text to the bastard as more available, as more acceptable to society, we are witnessing a movement in the way in which individual identity is, as it were, looked at. Also remember that the case of pregnancies and people leaving children at the churches was gradually increasing. Therefore, the bastard was a problem. The problem of the bastard was a definite problem. So in that sense, Fielding's Tom Jones is trying to argue that they should not be put away, but also integrated into society. So that is at one level the issue of the bastard. But at another level, the bastard has a different connotation here. Who is the bastard? Is it just Tom Jones and his reintegration, his parentage? Or let me widen this out a little bit and argue that it is the novel which is the real bastard in Tom Jones. Because the novel has no identity. It is merely something which is there, which is trying to come up, a new province of writing. And that is why it must be given a kind of a parentage. And that is why, you see, Fielding is falling back upon classical sources, myths, so on and so forth, newer kinds of biographies, autobiographies, criminal biographies. So, in many ways, it is the novel which is the bastard. And the journey of Tom Jones is trying to provide the bastard with a kind of an identity by formulating a lineage and a theory of the novel. The novel itself is sought to be given an identity through the prefatory chapters, through the use of myths, through the use of different genres that go into allying it, through the picaresque, and so on and so forth. Right? So that is where, you see, the issue of the bastard becomes so important in Tom Jones. One small issue which I would like to touch, since this might be asked to you in different forums, is whether Tom Jones is a picaresque. After all, Fielding's hero is supposedly a person born to be hanged. But you see, the picaresque draws from the Spanish word picaroon, as you know, who is an outcast, who is a rogue, who is involved in tricking others, and who causes mayhem in society. But Fielding's hero is not a picaresque, or Fielding's novel, because of two things. One is that the base born person who's out of society is sought to be integrated into society. He becomes the heir of Paradise Hall. And therefore, the Picaro, apparent Picaro, turns out to be a gentleman. The second thing is that the Picaro is marked by isolation. The Picaro is marked by a lack of feeling for society. In fact, it is through the Picaro that the satiric can operate against society. In this particular case, Tom is a far more Christian individual, right, who's marked by generosity, charity, so on and so forth, and the desire to help people. So, unlike the Picaro, Tom Jones wants to engage with society, follows a certain Christian value pattern, and is finally reintegrated into society. Thus, only the element of the picaresque, of the movement through different segments of society, through adventures, through the lower class life, depiction of lower class life, is what makes Tom Jones a picaresque novel, a part picaresque novel. Only a very small part of it is picaresque. Right? So, if you're asked, is Tom Jones a picaresque? No, it is not. Neither is Joseph Andrews. The only picaresque novel that Fielding wrote was a text called Jonathan Wild. Right? Please keep that in the back of your mind if you're asked this question. Now, the final issue that I would like to take up in this particular session is how Fielding represents women in the novel. Is Fielding empowering women, or is he a misogynist in certain ways? Now, you see, one of the things that you have to notice is how Fielding considers, femme fatales at every single point in the text, every single segment of the text. And very interestingly, one of the major symbols in the text becomes the female breast. Now, the female breast in earlier literatures has been seen as a source of sustenance, a source of motherhood, and a source of purity. In Fielding, however, There are copious references to Molly Seagram's breasts, Mrs. Waters' milky white breasts, and also to Lady Bellaston's sexuality. So, in that sense, Fielding's women do not seem to be, maternal. We do not see any positive aspect of Fielding's women. Rather, we locate only Fielding's uh, Fielding's view of women as essentially sexualized and therefore liable to cause mayhem in society. Even Sophia Western, who is the paragon of virtue and love, is seen as impulsive, defying her father's authority and chasing after Tom Jones. So does Mrs. Fitzpatrick, and ends up in problems. Therefore, the question of Fielding's treatment of women is rather tenuous because it is a heavily masculine world that Fielding presents, the world of adventure of Tom Jones, where women are there primarily because one, either of their sexuality represented through their breasts, or as a kind of a goal of property. You see, it's not just Sophia who's important, but also very importantly, the Allworthy, this Western estate. So her body, her physical body, and the body the of the estate become, as it were, integrated, so that Tom is aspiring towards both in that sense of the term. So, my point being, Fielding's, representation of women in this novel is largely reductive, heavily sexualized, and the female body is seen either as a site for desire or property, for possession, or as a destabilizing agent which can cause havoc in society. It is thus that I can suggest that Fielding's representation of women, as I say, is very patriarchal. This is an extremely, extremely patriarchal novel in the text. All the other women are reduced to mere footnotes. They have very little roles. In fact, the entire role of the novel belongs to men. Even Bridget Allworthy, the mother of Tom Jones, is shown to be, involved in an illicit relationship, producing a child who is then, who has to search for his whole life, for his own identity. Right. So, a very heavily patriarchal novel that Fielding is writing, which is providing very little avenues for women. Right. So those are some of the issues which I wanted to take up. What we've done is we've discussed the use of myths. We've discussed the use of the issue of the bastard, the importance of Paradise Hall, and finally we've taken a look at the presentation of women in society. Now, it's a question which is posed by Snigdha. Snigdha writes, "Sir, to show realism in characters, why Fielding made Tom as libidinous and unfaithful? There are naturalistic negativity too. Why specifically these?" You see, Snigdha, one of the things that you have to remember is that the novel is an agent of pleasure. So you read a novel primarily because you want to be pleased. And remember that, the two, operative medium of pleasure in this, in while reading texts, is money and sex, right? Therefore, libidinous, therefore, this entire element of sexuality is an important constituent of the novel. You see, look at the novels, for example, Pamela, almost about to be raped, Joseph Andrews, the question of love and romance, Tom Jones, the question of libido once again. So to create these series of adventures, Tom Fielding is creating a series of women with whom Tom can have this libidinous encounter. But the most important thing is also, again, if you see what is the fault of Adam and Eve. Now, the tree of knowledge is also, once again, the kind of fall of Adam and Eve is once again their initiation into sexuality, right? So it is seen as the original kind of a sin, the first instinct within men and women. Therefore, Fielding is playing upon that and showing how, one must triumph over one's senses through prudence to arrive at any kind of governmentality, right? After all, at the end of the novel, Tom proves to be the magistrate of Allworthy Hall. So, in order to impose order upon society, the first and the basic instinct, sex is after all the basic instinct that you all are aware of, it has to be curbed, right? So it is in that sense that for this kind of a popular, appeal, this kind of mythical quality, that Tom's libidinousness becomes the first priority in the novel. There's also another question which you've asked. Is there any connection between Fielding's characters and Wordsworthian type of characterization? I am not sure what you mean by the Wordsworthian type of characterization. The Wordsworthian characterization would be the egotistical, sublime, the imaginative character. I don't think there are any similarities. In any case, Wordsworth is writing well after Fielding, right? In the case of Fielding, you see, the egotistical sublime does not engage with society in Wordsworth. He's locked in his own imaginative universe. On the other hand, Tom Jones is a character who perennially engages with society. The novel's characters are very importantly characters who move outwards. And that is where the energy of the novel comes from. The social realist novel actually must engage with society through its characters. Therefore, I don't think really there are any similarities between the Wordsworthian protagonist and Fielding's protagonist. Right. Lower class people into being. No, you see, that is a different thing altogether. Yeah, I would rather say that, you see, to foreground the lower class into the fiction is something that the novel is doing much earlier than Wordsworth, one. And secondly, the form that Fielding is referring to here is comedy, right? In fact, what Wordsworth is trying to do, if you look at it carefully, is that Wordsworth is trying to show the nobility within the inferior classes, the nobility within the common people, say poems like The Leech Gatherer, The Dignity, and so on and so forth. But Fielding is rather showing a different set. He's showing how there is corruption and there's greed in every class of society, be it the lower classes or be it the higher classes. So in terms of human folly and human greed, which needs to be corrected, Fielding exists on a different plane than Wordsworth. Wordsworth is trying to show their nobility and their generosity, right? So I would not really bring these two, as it were, authors and poets together. Right? I hope that I have answered your question. These are the issues of Tom Jones. In the final class, which is tomorrow at 10:30, I will discuss a very important topic which sets aside Tom Jones and is very important for your batch also, is the issue of the prefatory chapters. What is the importance of the 18 prefatory chapters, each book having a discourse between the author and the reader? And what does Fielding, as the author of the novel, try to do within these 18 chapters? Well, that's all about today morning. Today afternoon at 2:30, once again, we meet with Tristram Shandy, a different novel from Fielding, and we shall take a look very carefully. I'm sorry, not by Fielding, but by Sterne, and we shall take an introductory look at what this novel is all about. Tomorrow at 10:30, once again, we meet with the final class of Tom Jones. Thank you very much for your. By the way, the language of the people in Wordsworth are never really vulgar. Although Wordsworth talks about the language of common men, if you take a look at Wordsworth's poetry, he's sublimating the language into something which is eminently imaginative and poetic. Don't take Wordsworth's language of men very seriously, right? Anyways, so see you at once again 2:30 today afternoon and 10:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you for your patience and have a good day.